It's a scorchingly hot day in June of the year 1210. Having fled the savage destruction of neighboring Béziers by Catholic crusaders, a group of Cathar faithful climb into the foothills of the Haute-Languedoc, seeking shelter and refuge. Tired, scared, not knowing if their next night would be their last, they struggle through the rocky terrain. Cresting yet another hill, they catch their breath as the village of Minerve appears suddenly before them, precariously perched on a rock outcrop surrounded by gorges. Could this be the sanctuary they seek? Hot on their heels is the brutally efficient killing machine leading the Crusaders, Simon de Montfort, along with several thousand well-armed and zealous men, eager to carry out the Pope's orders and wipe the heretical Cathars off the face of the earth. What happens over the next 5 weeks will become indelibly etched on the town for the next 800 years.
Join me as we relive those events from so many years ago, and as we journey forward into more pleasant times in Minerve. We'll look at how Minerve has changed from a bloody battlefield to a bastion of outstanding wine production, and we'll put the two together to bring you some outstanding pairings of wine and history. I'm Richard Carton, and this is Bottles and Battles. Welcome, fellow travelers and wine enthusiasts, to the town of Minerve in the Languedoc region of southern France. We're about 2 hours east of Toulouse, situated amongst the gorges of the river Brian, which you can see behind me. And it is here in the village of Minerve that some of the most memorable events of the Catholic Crusade against the Cathars took place. Unfortunately, they were memorable for all the wrong reasons. For those unfamiliar with the Cathars and the Crusade against them, the Cathars were a religious group that believed in the concept of dualism. They argued that the world as it existed, with so many bad things happening for every good thing, could not be fully explained by an all-powerful, all-loving, all-good deity. Instead, they believed in two equal and opposing forces, kind of like Newton's laws of physics, only with gods. This earth was the evil plane, and a person's goal in life was to be as good as possible so they could be welcomed into the perfect world afterwards. In practice, they believed that Jesus had neither a physical incarnation nor a resurrection. After all, you can't resurrect what was never alive to begin with. They rejected many of the sacraments of the Catholic Church, including marriage, believing instead solely in the consolamentum, a rite performed on the verge of death. They believed everyone should have access to spiritual teachings, so preaching should be done in common language rather than in Latin. And they allowed women to preach, greatest heresy of all, perhaps. All of these beliefs flew in the face of Catholic teachings. So the church formally denounced the Cathars as heretics and started a crusade to reform or purge them. That crusade was known as the Albigensian Crusade. So why Albigensian, you ask? We've been talking about Cathars. Well, because at the time, the new sect was not known as Cathars. It's only recently that this term has become popular to refer to them. Instead, at that time, they were called the Albigeois, after the city of Albi, which is about an hour north of Toulouse, because that was a hotbed of Cathar sentiment at the time. But if you look closer at the events in the Languedoc at the time of the Crusade, they suggest a much more powerful offense that the Cathars committed, other than the heresies the church was relying on. Being more ascetic than the Catholics, they criticized the church's wealth and power. So you can easily imagine the uproar this created among Catholic clergy, who at the time were living comfortable and privileged lives as the common citizens turned against them because of the Cathar teachings. If you're interested in learning more about the Cathars and the Albigensian Crusade, I'll soon be posting a separate video about them. Subscribe below so that you can get it as soon as it goes out, and please like this video if you want more content like this. We're now heading down into one of the main entrances to the village of Minerve. There's a single bridge for cars that you saw earlier that's coming into town, but that's reserved for the few residents of this town. Right now, the population is about 130 people, and I want you to keep that in mind for later. So if we stop just before the entrance, you'll see these gorges running down each side. So these are the paths of the Brian and the Cesse rivers, as I noted. The Brian's on our left, and the Cesse is on the right as we look into town. So let's take a look at this tower right on the edge of town. This
was the citadel of the then governor of Minerve, Guillaume de Minerve. And this is all that remains from that time 800 years ago.
So I'm now standing in front of the gorge where the bed of the river Cess is. It's pretty dry right now. It's been a bit of a dry year here, but there are times when this is actually full. You can see the bridge that's the single point of access for cars coming into Minerve for the residents only, and that was built in the early 1900s. In the centuries following the Crusade, Minerve has become quite a tourist destination. So now the streets, as we'll see in a minute, are filled with shops, art galleries, wine tasting rooms, bookstores, and more.
In his 1993 book, Mémoire Cathare, Gérard Simonnet beautifully captures the spirit of Minerve. At sunset, when the rock and the facades of the houses are adorned with ochre, when the mouths of the valleys fill with shade, when the cypresses stretch beyond their reach, Minerve appears to weigh anchor and set sail for the ocean of dreams where its ancient splendor shines.
Now we're just above the River Brian, and you can see that we've got some water here that's starting to course through the riverbed. This is relatively new. It's been pretty dry this year, so that's been pretty empty most of the year. But let's get back to our friends the Cathars. In 1210, as I mentioned, the man in charge of Minerve was named Guillaume de Minerve. He was very sympathetic to the Cathar cause, and he was also a big supporter of Occitan independence. Now, the region we're in, Languedoc, is part of a greater region which is called Occitanie. And this was an independent region before this was part of France. In 1210, this region was not actually part of France. So Guillaume de Minerve was a supporter of both the Cathars and Occitan independence. But unfortunately, the lord of one of the neighboring towns, Narbonne, which we'll actually go to in another episode, was not a big fan of Guillaume de Minerve. So his name was Aimery, and he was the Vicomte of Narbonne. He actually had been looking for a reason to come up here and deal Guillaume a little blow. So he committed his forces into the hands of Simon de Montfort, who, as I mentioned, was the military leader of the Cathar Crusade. And together, they marched on the village. All right, so behind me, you can see the junction where the rivers Brian and Cess meet. And then when there's actually a lot of water here, will flow further south. Narbonne, the village I mentioned to you, is about 30 kilometers or 20 miles just south of us. We're facing south now. So you can imagine the tension amongst the inhabitants knowing that the joint forces of Simon de Montfort and Aimery, the Vicomte de Narbonne, were marching towards the town.
But Minerve wasn't terribly easy to enter, and the villagers had no intention of giving up easily to the Crusaders. So at the time, the North Causeway, that's where we entered, where we saw the citadel of Guillaume de Minerve. That was guarded by that citadel. That was a very narrow entrance point, and it was heavily guarded. And no easy passage would come past that citadel. So invaders who would try to enter from the south would be open to attack from above. You see, they'd have to come through the riverbeds, and they would have to try and cross. If it was dry, obviously a lot easier. But we'll see in just a second that there are times when the passage was made even more difficult by water flowing through the riverbed. And at times this would fill completely, making it even more difficult to reach the other side and get into the village of Minerve. Simon de Montfort was an expert tactician and a very skilled commander. So rather than risk his forces in an ill-advised assault across the gorge, he decided to siege the town and bombard it from across the gorge. He placed 4 siege engines around the town, both mangonels and a standard trebuchet, and the Crusaders called the most powerful of the 4 La Malevoisine, and there she stands today. La Malevoisine is French for bad neighbor, an interesting choice of terms for something that's throwing rocks across at you. Even though trebuchet itself is masculine, they named her La Malevoisine, a feminine name. And she was set up, as you can see, on the eastern side of the Brian River Gorge. So today, we have a replica there. It is 800 years ago that this happened, and obviously they needed their siege engines in other places. But the replica is a reminder of the terror that the villagers here would experience for 5 weeks, as there was just a sustained assault on the town from all sides. We're going to head over and take a closer look at La Malevoisine in just a few minutes. But first I want to show you how Minerve has made a modern tribute to its ancient past. So to get to La Malevoisine, we're going to have to descend a stairway and go down to that riverbed, and we're going to cross over. So it may not seem like a terribly long way down, but in the year 1210, there obviously weren't a lot of stairs like this, and you would have to find your way up the rock. So imagine being a soldier in sweltering summer heat. You're wearing a helmet of some sort, you're wearing armor of some sort, whether it be leather, whether it be chain, and you're trying to make your way up into this village. So you'll understand why perhaps they didn't really want to try that route, rather instead trying to force the villagers to give up. Now here's where we have the tribute, because what Minerve has done in creating this staircase is they've made a replica of the trebuchet itself as part of the staircase. So we're down in the riverbed, and you can see the beginnings of the River Brian starting to fill the bed. When I was here earlier in the summer, there's not a drop of water to be seen. And that's pretty typical around here in the summer, that this becomes a completely dry riverbed. But as you'll notice, once this riverbed fills, it becomes a little difficult to get to this crossing point. There's a famous old poem, which is an account of the Albigensian Crusade, and it's called Canso. And it's well known because it actually chronicles the Crusades. There's someone who was sent by the Catholic Church to basically be the secretary of the Crusade, who would take notes of everything that happened. Now, the interesting part about Canso is, of the two writers, only one is known. So the very first writer was the person appointed by the Catholic Church to go along with the Crusade and chronicle it. And they were a very big adherent of the Catholic Church, so they were a big supporter of the Crusade. And it's clear in the language of the early parts of the Canso how much support there was for the Crusade against the Cathars. But as you shift to the new author, you find a person who was much more conflicted about what was going on and about the death and devastation that was being waged upon the Cathar people, who were very peaceful. They really just wanted to live their lives, try to teach people what they thought was the way to live their life, and they weren't trying to hurt the Catholic Church at all. So this person had a very different approach to Canso, and the tone changes quite a bit as you go through the poem. But at the time Simon de Montfort was sieging Minerve, the writer of Canso was the Catholic secretary. And there's a description in Canso of La Malevoisine herself. In the words of Canso, de Montfort fait Malevoisine esas otras perieras e dona e reina, which roughly translated into English means that de Montfort built La Malevoisine, who, among his other catapults, was the lady and the queen. Now, even though de Montfort's army would not cross the ravine, the villagers were a little more brave about that. Knowing the damage that La Malevoisine could cause, a group of the villagers snuck out into the ravine under cover of night on the night of June 27, 1210, scaling the far side of the gorge and heading up to La Malevoisine. They reached it successfully, and they set fire to the trebuchet and the surrounding encampment, but a traitor within their ranks had warned de Montfort's army that the attack was coming. So the army was able to quickly put out the fire, scatter the villagers, and actually what became of those villagers at the end of the day is lost to history. But what is certain is that La Malevoisine was soon back in business. So we're some distance away now from where we were crossing the river to begin with, and you can still see Malevoisine just up in the hills there. Now, it's clear that de Montfort's men spent time launching rocks into the village itself, destroying buildings, causing lots of damage and injury and death. But their primary target was actually here on the edge of town. So as any good commander of a siege knows, the best way to get people to come out from a siege is to starve them to death and cut off all of their supplies. And here in Minerve, especially when the rivers were empty, there was only one source of water. And that source of water came from a well on the edge of town. This is the well. So de Montfort did what any good commander would do. He ordered his men to attack the well itself because it was the only source of water other than rain and the rivers for the villagers. And rain is hard to come by here in the summers. Summers in this region are very dry, which is why you typically see very dry riverbeds. So the only way the villagers could get water was to descend a covered stairway and come down to the well. So as the siege neared its end, de Montfort's men reduced the staircase essentially to rubble and cut off access to the well. And then the normal enemies of every siege town hit: hunger, disease, thirst, vermin. So the villagers were also throwing their dead into the gorges to get rid of the smell, and almost certainly as well the rats. You could only hold out so long in the face of so many difficulties, surrounded on all sides by siege engines and armies, water supply down to nothing, supplies cut off. So as July neared its close, Guillaume de Minerve made the very difficult decision to surrender. And on July 22nd, the Crusader armies were allowed into town. They marched in through the causeway that we came in at the entrance to Minerve next to Guillaume's tower. And they were very solemnly singing the Te Deum Laudamus as they entered the town. We're going to actually go back up through town from the back way here and go to one of the most significant spots in Minerve with respect to the Crusade. So by the time the Crusaders marched into town, another one of the Crusade's major figures and one of its most barbaric had joined forces with de Montfort and Aimery de Narbonne. And his name was Arnaud Aimery. Now, legend has it that Aimery and de Montfort and Aimery de Narbonne debated what should be done with the Cathar prisoners. Initially, and surprisingly, de Montfort, who was not known for being particularly nice or gentle or kind, suggested that the Cathar prisoners be treated a little more leniently. But Aimery and Aimery de Narbonne had very different opinions about the punishment that the Cathar should receive. And after some vigorous debate, their hotter heads prevailed. After this discussion, the Cathar faithful were gathered here in front of the small Catholic church in Minerve, and Arnaud Aimery gave them a choice. And it was a very simple one. It was repent of your heretical ways or die. Very simple. But the Cathars were very true to their faith, and they were not particularly scared of death. So one of the Cathars is alleged to have looked at Aimery and said, "Neither death nor life will tear us away from the faith we have chosen." So they chose death. One interesting fact about the little church here, and unfortunately we're on a day when it's not open, but inside there are two altars. And one of the altars here allegedly dates from the year 456. And just think about that. We're talking about 1700 years ago, basically. It's actually considered to be one of the oldest altars known to exist in Europe. So someday we'll actually get back here on a day when it's open, and I'll update the episode to show you the actual altar. At this point, the Cathars are refusing to repent. The Catholics are refusing to relent. And so we've reached what's the critical impasse in our story. Getting no satisfaction in the response he was seeking, Arnaud Aimery instructed his soldiers to begin building a pyre, assembling wood for a large bonfire. Now, seeing what was about to happen, three Cathar women chose to submit to Arnaud Aimery, to essentially give up their Cathar faith. Now, I want you to remember, when we came into the village, we talked about the population of the village, and it was 130. The number of Cathars assembled here in front of the church in the year 1210, in July of 1210, was 140, plus those other three women. 140 Cathars chose to be burned at the stake rather than give up their faith
And at the end of July in 1210, that's exactly what happened. All 140 were put to death, were marched into those flames. Some allegedly hurled themselves in, screaming support of their faith as they went. Now, we'll never know how much of those legends are true, but the accounts are fairly well presented in La Canso as well. And even though this history is fairly gruesome, very dark, very morbid, this little area is actually one of my favorite spots in Minerve. And it's not because of the church here or the 4th century altar or the fabulous view down to the bridge. Instead, this is a point of contrast. It's a point of showing the differences between the two sides, because what we have now on the other side of this patio is a memorial to the Cathar faithful who were burned at the stake. It's a very simple piece. It's just a piece of stone with the dove of peace carved into it. And it's a spot where you can come and just experience a little bit of peaceful reflection and think about the wars that have gone on through history in the name of religion and the terrible things that have happened, and yet people who held very, very tightly to their beliefs and their own truths, even to the point of their deaths. So even though we have the church representing the burning of the Cathars, we have something beautiful in their memory as well. So I always say that this spot becomes a very spiritual moment for me here. And I'm not a religious person, but I can understand the concept of spirituality. It's a moment where you really think about your life and the lives of others and what they mean and what people have gone through that you could never possibly imagine. And so there's a very different feeling that comes over you here that's quite a stark contrast to knowing what happened, the horrific events that happened here. You can still get a sense of peace and spirituality as you sit here and just ponder the Cathars and their history. It's also a little bit of a shame that we're not here a little later in the day, because we're facing a direction where when the sun goes down, you can get even more of a sense of what happened here, because the glow from the sunset can put orange light behind the dove, making it look as if you can see the very flames that the Cathars were subjected to. And I always enjoy this shot as well, which is the clear juxtaposition of the two, of the Catholic cross and the Cathar memorial here. Well, now we've reached the end of our story, so it's time for us to do what the episode's all about, which is pairing some wines with that history. We're going to walk down to a little restaurant here in town called Aux Deux Rivières. It's called that, the Two Rivers, because it's actually situated right above that spot where we were looking at the confluence of the two rivers earlier. We're going to have a little lunch, and we're going to walk you through the wines. We're going to walk past a few of the shops and the wine tasting rooms, the galleries on our way down to the restaurant. This gallery here actually is one of the favorites of my stepson, who's bought several pieces of art here. The artist there takes the history of the region and incorporates it into his drawings. So he does a lot of sketches where you can see faces coming out of the rocks, out of the village of Minerve that represents the Cathars and the events that happened in the town. Here we've got a little wine tasting room. Looks like it's closed today, but we've got several of those throughout town. For those who come to visit, there's another fantastic restaurant here. Unfortunately, it's closed for January, but it's called Relais Chantovant, and it has a little terrace attached to the main dining room that actually juts out over the gorge. And there's a beautiful kind of orangey red awning over it, so when the sun's beating down, you get this very diffuse red light that's all around you while you're eating. They have outstanding food. And we're gonna just turn the corner up here. One interesting thing for you to know if you ever come to Minerve, Wi-Fi can be difficult up here. So several of the restaurants don't take credit cards. Just remember that. Bring cash with you if you want to eat here. Chantovant takes credit cards. I'm hoping that de Rivières does as well, because if not, we may have some trouble today. Welcome to Eau de Rivières. That's where we're going to be having our lunch today. Right now we're a little early for it, so it's still closed. They're doing a bit of a truffle menu today, so fortunately I'm going to be treating myself. Won't always be the case when I'm out and about, but it's actually a really interesting menu, and it should pair well with the wines that I'm picking as well. I'm going to start today with a white, move on to a red, and we'll do those two pairings for you.
So here we are now in Eau de Rivières for lunch. You can see we've got the truffle menu in front of us. The first course is going to be some scallops with some shaved truffles and a truffle emulsion around it. Second course is going to be a soft boiled egg that has some parsnip puree beneath it and some crumbled truffles, as well as some very highly toasted almonds. The next course, unfortunately, they didn't have the quail, which is what's listed on the menu, so it's actually going to be a roulade of chicken. That also has some shaved truffles with it. And the last course is a dessert course that has a chocolate ganache. It's got a praline cream, and it actually also has a little bit of shaved truffle on it. We're going to have the white wine for the first two courses, and I'm going to shift in the middle of the second course to a red, and we'll see how each of those work with this menu. Our white today comes from the town of Saint-Jean-de-Minervois, which is just over the hills. Saint-Jean is known for doing very sweet wines made from a Muscat grape. That's their primary product here. And as you can see in the cooperative that we're looking at right now, they very strongly focus on the Muscat. But there's a lot more to this town than just sweet Muscat. Indeed, there's a couple in town who are making really interesting wines, really interesting dry wines with a lot of interesting grapes. And their winery is called Clos du Gravillas. Well, the first time I was here, I was met at the gate by a tall man with curly dark hair and glasses who began asking me a few questions in French. Now, I had called ahead because we had come out before and there wasn't anyone here, so we called to make up an appointment. And I arrived at the time that we had set, and he was standing there at the gate. So after these few questions in French, he looks at me and he says, "You're not from around here, are you?" In perfect English. So funnily enough, John, who along with his wife Nicole is the owner and winemaker at Clos du Gravillas, he originally hails from Kentucky. So as a fellow Southerner, because I'm from Alabama, we shared a few laughs about how we both ended up in a fairly unknown region of France before we went in to do the tasting. Now, Nicole is not from Kentucky. She's French. She's from around this area, not Saint-Jean itself, but close by. They've been working at Clos du Gravillas for around 30 years. And as you can see, we're coming right up to the gates now. Anyway, after this discussion, John led me into the tasting room where we proceeded to work through most of his range of wines. And I was really excited because John likes to work with grapes that are historically associated with the Languedoc, these older grapes that are less popular now. They're not the Chardonnays and the Sauvignon Blancs. They're what we call anciennes cépages, the ancient varieties. So they're much less widely used now, but there's some really interesting wines. And you can see the tasting room here. And it's one of those wines that relies on those ancient grapes that are vinified in different types of containers. So they use, for instance, clay amphora, and they use some concrete eggs. And they're making great wines with that. So that's what we're going to be trying today. The white I've chosen today is called Emmenez-moi au bout de terret, which is a pun around the phrase, take me to the ends of the earth in French. But instead of terre, which would be earth, you have the terret, which is the ancien cépage, the old grape. This wine is made from 100% terret gris, which is gray terret. And terret gris was also in this region known as terret bourré. This is a small batch production from a vineyard where the vines are more than 50 years old, and they're very, very selective about what grapes are used. They actually hand pick the grapes, choosing exactly which grapes they want to use for the wine. They intentionally have a very low yield so they can get super high quality. John and Nicole suggest drinking this wine with scallops, and as you saw, the first course in this tasting menu is scallops. So let's see if he's right. A few notes about this wine before we get into the pairing. First of all, it's organic. They use many fewer pesticides. They try to work very naturally with the grapes while they're growing, and they do very little in terms of chemical additions when they're actually vinifying the wine. The appellation for the wine is IGP Côtes du Brian, so it comes from the hillsides along the Brian River. That's the Côtes du Brian. For those of you who have followed my notes on how to do a tasting, I'm going to walk through a little bit of what I picked up in the wine before I ever had any food with it. First of all, you've got a light to medium lemon color, medium plus acid, so it's really fresh and crisp. A little bit of medium plus intensity on the nose, so you can really get the scent, the aromas of the wine. Medium finish. What you really pick up at first is citrus and white flowers with just a hint of something a little richer and a little bit of perhaps salinity, minerality to it. And I know if any of you know wine very well, you know minerality is a no-no word lately, and there's a big debate about what minerality means, and I'll do a separate episode on that. I'm not a fan of the people who object to minerality. I think it's an excellent descriptor, so I'll use it. Now, early on, I had a little bit of this with some flatbread and a little bit of herbed butter made with herbs straight out of the garden here, and it really kind of cut the richness of the butter. The citrus notes of the wine cut that richness and fat of the butter and really made a nice pairing. But I have to tell you, when I had it with the scallops, it was a revelation. It, oddly enough, brought out notes of honey or honeysuckle when you actually drank this very citrusy, crisp wine and ate it with those scallops. Now, you'd expect honey to come from an older wine or different types of vinification than was done here, so I found it really interesting. But it was an absolutely gorgeous pairing, so John and Nicole were dead on. I'm still getting used to doing these videos, so unfortunately, it just skipped my mind to actually pull my phone back out and film the second course. But I'll tell you a little bit about how it paired with that soft-boiled egg on the parsnip puree. Interestingly enough, even though there's that tremendous richness in that course, very similar to the butter in the amuse-bouche at the beginning, it actually wound up making this wine taste much more astringent and a little less pleasant when it was coupled with that course. The course itself was absolutely delightful, but you shifted away from citrus notes. You actually picked up more on the lines of some stone fruit, so like a white peach, something along those lines. But the astringency really came out, and it was a much better pairing actually with the scallop. And now we get to the point where I talk about why I picked this wine. How is this my pairing of wine in history? Well, just as Guillaume de Minerve wanted to preserve the Occitan independent region, while also allowing a new religion to flourish there, John and Nicole want to preserve the use of historical grapes while making them feel new again. And they've been very successful. If you can find their wines, you have to try them. They're absolutely fantastic. And another one of my favorites from them is an old vine Carignan from vines that are more than a century old. But you can't find a better blend in this area of tradition and modernity than you will find at Clos du Gravillas. Welcome to my home studio in Ginestas. We're here in my house, which is somewhat over 300 years old. It's always an interesting concept for me to think of being in a house that's actually older than the United States itself. But it's a great place to be, and we really enjoy it here. We're coming to the main part of the podcast, and it's also an object lesson in things don't always go as planned. So when I planned this episode, I based it on the wine we're going to do next. This was the wine I wanted above all others to do in this episode. And it's from a winery nearby on the way from Ginestas to Minerve called Domaine Vordy. And you can see it as you're driving up to Minerve, perched on the hillside across the gorge. It's one of my favorite wineries in the area. Now, what happened? Well, when I chose Clos du Rivières as the place to go do my pairings, I looked at their wine list online, looked at the menu online, saw that they had both of the wines that I wanted. When I got there, however, and this is not unusual in the area. This happens quite a bit at most restaurants and bars, including mine. They were out. So I'm having to do the pairing back here in the home studio, but hopefully that won't diminish the appreciation of the wine. So let's talk a little bit about Domaine Vordy. As I mentioned, they're a winery that you can see driving up to Minerve. They have about 85 acres of vines and about 6 different grape varieties, including some very old vines that are more than 100 years old. About 10 years ago, they went fully organic, and they do wines that, while the grapes they use are very typical of the area, the actual result is quite different. So what do I mean by that? Well, they use Syrah, Grenache, Carignan, Mourvèdre. Those are the wines that those are the grapes that are going to be in the wine we're trying today. And those are very typical grapes used in the Languedoc region. What you find, however, is that a lot of different wineries, what you wind up with is very similar. You have a fairly powerful wine, oftentimes very high in alcohol, and it's very in your face at times, very, very forward. And you'll find that from winery to winery to winery to winery, they almost all have one bottle that's got that same mix and tastes very similar. The reason I like Domaine Vordy and the approach they take is because they take those very typical grapes and they turn them into something a little different. So their vinification process is slightly different than many who ferment these grapes in steel tanks and then blend them together. So the Syrah, the Grenache, and the Mourvèdre are fermented separately. They remain in the fermentation tank for 8 weeks. Then, while they're doing that, they're pumping over. So pumping over is taking the wine from the bottom of the tank, doing exactly what it sounds like, bringing it back over to the top, because then it permeates the skins, which have all risen to the top of the fermentation tank. So it pushes that back down and blends the skins back in, so you're getting a little more extraction. They blend after this, after those 8 weeks. So after blending, the wine's split in two. Half go into French oak barrels, half go into vats, and they stay there for a year. You've also got the Carignan being fermented separately, and they're doing something with the Carignan called carbonic maceration. Well, carbonic maceration is when you take whole clusters of grapes. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen the process of getting grapes into the winery and into the fermentation tanks, but a lot of times what they'll do is they first destem them. After they sort through, get rid of the bad ones, they'll destem. And so you've got just the grapes coming through, and then those are crushed and put in the vat. In carbonic maceration, you take whole clusters of grapes and dump them in the vat. And what happens is fermentation begins inside the grapes themselves, rather than in this big fermentation mass. As that goes on, the grapes begin to rupture, both because of the pressure inside from the gas that's building because of fermentation, and because of the weight as they're pressing down on each other. What happens is you get brighter fruit flavors from the Carignan, and you get softer tannins. There are also some very typical flavors that are associated with carbonic maceration in kind of the red licorice candy range, sometimes a little bit of banana, and some spices like cardamom. But then at the end, you take the blend of all of these 4 grapes. And what you get from Domaine Vordy Françoise, and that's the wine we're talking about, is Françoise from Domaine Vordy. Françoise starts out with a little bit of that typicity of the Languedoc. You feel the power of those grapes, but then it shifts into something completely different. And by the end, you're noticing a much more elegant, refined wine than these others I've talked about, where it's just power from front to back. So what we're going to do is do a little tasting here. I've got my Françoise. And you'll see that it's a relatively deep ruby color. It's not quite fully opaque. You can still see a little bit through down towards the stem, but in general, it's fairly consistent from the center to the rim. There's a slight lightening at the edge. So when you take that breath, the first thing you get is the fruit there. You've got a little bit of a black fruit, a little bit of red fruit. So you've got just a hint of blackberry. You've got some plum. You've got some raspberry going on here. And there's just a hint of spice at the end of it. So now we're going to try it. And it lives up to what I get with this every time. Start with the fruit, but the power of the Syrah and the Grenache and the Mourvedre, it's not highly tannic, which given those grapes could be an option. It's a little bit acidic, medium plus maybe, but mostly what you're getting right at the beginning is the fruit. As it goes towards the back of your throat, you feel a little bit of the acid along the sides of your tongue, sides of your cheeks. You're not getting a lot of that tannin feel right on the top of your lip. If you let it sit for a second and then take another sip, and on the second sip, I want you to focus on secondary, tertiary flavors. So if you've watched my wine tasting videos, or the ones that will be coming out soon, you'll see this notion of primary, secondary, tertiary flavors. And those come from different parts of the vinification process. Primary is really the fruit itself and the primary fermentation products. Secondary is later in the fermentation and post-fermentation processes. And tertiary is really from aging. This is not a terribly old wine. It's only a couple of years old, so it's not going to have a lot of those tertiary flavors to it. But you are getting some of the carbonic maceration flavors from the Carignan. And you're getting a little bit of that softness as well. And if you focus on that second sip of trying to pick out the non-fruit flavors, you're getting hints of spice. You're getting just a smidge of vanilla from the French oak. And those flavors help kind of tamp down the power of those typical grapes that we use here in the Languedoc and that are in Vordy Françoise. I obviously didn't get to try the Vordy Françoise with the truffle menu. Unfortunately, I would have liked to have seen how it would have paired. The hostess suggested to me that perhaps it would have been a little too light for the menu. However, given the fact that the quail wasn't available and it shifted to just chicken roulade, I think that actually overall the meal was probably too light across the board for even a more elegant red like Vordy Françoise. But the truffles and the earthiness of the truffles and some of that parsnip puree might have gone quite well with the Vordy. So it's a shame I didn't get to try that. But let's talk about why I actually chose Vordy Françoise. Why was this the single wine that I wanted to base the entire episode on? It's because to me, it's incredibly reminiscent of my trips through Minerve. When I go to Minerve, the first thing I see is that imposing rock structure and the stone buildings that are lining the top of it. So it's something that your first glance of is power, right? It's this big rock and big stone buildings. But as you saw, as I walked through Minerve and went through the story of the Cathars, where I wound up was at the Cathar Dove. And even though I had a very somber visit as I wandered through, recalling the siege and what the residents of Minerve went through in those 5 weeks of the year 1210, where I wound up, despite the horrific ending, despite the burning of the 140 Cathars, is at a point that was much more spiritual and ethereal. And that's very similar to what I get from Françoise. At the beginning, you get very typical Languedoc flavors and a little hint of power. And you're focused on those dark flavors that are coming through. But as you continue to drink the Vordy, what comes through is a little bit of delicacy, a little bit of elegance, something different from just the same flavor from the beginning to the end. And you hit that point where the wine becomes more ethereal, more spiritual, just like the visit to Minerve. And so from the very beginning, this is the wine that I wanted to introduce to you, to go along with your trip through Minerve. So if you do come to Minerve, and I hope you will, I think you'll really enjoy it, find Vordy Françoise. See if they've got it at Du Rivières, go have lunch there. See if they've got it at Relais Chantavant, go have lunch there and enjoy a bottle of this. And if you can't find it at either one of those, just drive 5 minutes away to the domain itself and grab a bottle. Take it home with you and give it a try, and you will not regret it, I guarantee you. Well, you've stuck with me through a lot, and I hope you've enjoyed your virtual visit to Minerve as much as I've enjoyed showing it to you. And I certainly hope that one day you will come and experience all of this for yourself. In the meantime, I thought I'd give you one last view of the Cathare Dove here in Minerve before we say goodbye. If you've enjoyed our visit to Minerve, please do click the like button and subscribe so that we know to keep making these kind of videos. We've got a few different things coming up. We are going to do an episode on a wine revolution that happened here in the early 1900s in the Languedoc. We're going to do an episode about wine production back in Roman times in the Languedoc. We're going to do something about the Canal du Midi, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site that connects the Atlantic to the Mediterranean across southern France. Then in February, I'm going to be heading towards a couple of wine trade shows, one in Barcelona, one in Paris. So we'll get outside of the Languedoc, give you some other regions, just for a little bit of variety. And as I come back from Paris, I'm going to hit quite a few of the different French wine regions and get a lot of different new and exciting videos for you. Thanks a lot for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed your time. Until next time, this is Richard Carden saying happy drinking and have a glass for me.